Good evening. Thanks for tuning into the premiere episode of our brand new show, O'Connor Tonight. I'm Larry O'Connor. Floridians are still assessing the damage and destruction left in Hurricane Ian's wake. The images of bridges and highways completely destroyed and entire neighborhoods left in rubble are harrowing. This is a time for prayers of condolence for those who have tragically lost their lives and whose homes and possessions have been destroyed, and prayers of gratitude on behalf of those who escaped with their lives and whose homes are still standing, thankfully. But here in Washington, D.C., sometimes the instinctive, compassionate, and humane thing to do has to take a backseat to divisive partisan politics. And there's a big election coming up in a month, so this storm must be shot through that lens. Hey, I don't make up the rules. And it turns out the governor of Florida, whose leadership, organization, and effectiveness is being tested by this extraordinary act of God, is not only facing voters for his re-election bid in just a handful of weeks, but he also happens to be a leading contender for the Republican nomination for president 2 years from now. Like it or not, the Hurricane Ian political conversation begins and ends with Governor Ron DeSantis. So, how's the governor who kept his state's schools, beaches, and restaurants and churches open during the pandemic while resisting Fauci's mask and vax mandates doing? Well, if the behavior of this CNN reporter is any indication, he's doing a pretty good job, and the media, well, they're getting more and more desperate.
Do you stand behind Lee County's decision to not have that mandatory evacuation until the day before the storm?
Well, where was your industry station when the storm hit? Were you guys in Lee County? No, you were in Tampa. So that's, they were following the weather track, and they had to make decisions based on that. But, 72 hours, they weren't even in the cone. 48 hours, they were on the periphery. So you got to make the decision.
That said, DeSantis is getting some positive reviews as well. Conservative columnist Mark Thiessen in the Washington Post, he compared DeSantis's hurricane press conferences with former President Donald Trump's COVID-19 briefings. And according to Thiessen, the comparison works pretty well in the Florida governor's favor. He wrote, "Watching DeSantis manage the crisis, conservatives should see a leader who can give them everything they love about Trump without belligerence and bad judgment." Thiessen also observed, DeSantis understands that in a crisis when Americans are scared and confused, they want information and they want action, not political theater. His press conferences have been pretty impressive. During one of them this weekend, he made a reasonable observation about the potential for looting in the Sunshine State.
The other thing that we're concerned about, particularly in those areas that were really hard hit, is, we want to make sure we're maintaining law and order. Don't even think about looting. Don't even think about taking advantage of people in this vulnerable situation. And so local law enforcement is involved in monitoring that. I told Kevin if the state needs to help as well, because you can have people bringing boats into some of these islands and trying to ransack people's homes. I can tell you in the state of Florida, you never know what may be lurking behind somebody's home. And I would not want to chance that if I were you, given that we're a Second Amendment state.
Yeah, that seems perfectly reasonable. And of course, the left, Democrats, the media, they're losing their mind. Here's the governor, the chief law enforcement officer of the state, warning potential criminals that there will be zero tolerance for looting. And let's face it, a criminal who would loot a home that has been abandoned while the owners evacuated to safety in the face of a natural disaster may be the single lowest, most despicable kind of individual on the planet. It's not only appropriate for an elected official to condemn such behavior and warn of severe criminal prosecutions for those who would attempt such a disgusting crime, but his warning, his reminder that every Floridian, every American for that matter, has the God-given right to protect their home and their families by employing their constitutionally protected right to bear arms. That's not just accurate and just, but it's also a pretty good safety tip for any potential looters out there. Ron DeSantis may have just saved some misguided criminal scum's life with that Second Amendment warning. Pretty compassionate in my mind. So who could possibly object to such a thing? Oh, enter Joy Reid. She took to Twitter, because they tweet all the time, don't you know? She says, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts. Segregationist Miami Sheriff Walter E. Headley, 1967. Didn't take DeSantis long to return to form." You know, we shouldn't be surprised at this point when Joy Reid raises the specter of racism in every single story America faces. In fact, I think that's why MSNBC employs her in the first place. But can we take a moment, please, to dissect exactly what Ms. Reid is saying here? See, Governor DeSantis merely warned looters that they would be arrested and prosecuted, and they run the risk of being shot if they try to loot a home where a homeowner might be defending his family and his property. Now, Joy Reid compares that to something a segregationist Democrat said back in the 60s. Joy Reid thinks that it's racist to warn a looter that they might get shot. Let's be clear. For one to believe that Ron DeSantis warning repercussions against looters is a racist statement, one must first contend that looters are black. See, that's what Joy Reid believes. She believes that looters in Florida must be black. That's kind of racist. I mean, we already knew that Joy Reid held bigoted views about homosexuals. You'll remember her tweets from years ago that were widely acknowledged as homophobic and transphobic. I mean, widely acknowledged because she acknowledged they were homophobic and transphobic. And ironically, one of those homophobic slurs targeted then Republican Governor Charlie Crist. That's right. She suggested Charlie Crist, who was a Republican at the time, was gay. She said it as if it was an insult. Here.
A community that I support and that I deeply care about is hurting because of some despicable and truly offensive posts being attributed to me. Now, many of you have seen these blog posts circulating online and in social media. Many of them are homophobic, discriminatory, and outright weird and hateful. When a friend found them in December and sent them to me, I was stunned. Frankly, I couldn't imagine where they'd come from or whose voice that was. In the months since, I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense of these posts. I hired cybersecurity experts to see if somebody had manipulated my words or my former blog. And the reality is they have not been able to prove it. But here's what I know. I genuinely do not believe I wrote those hateful things because they are completely alien to me. But I can definitely understand based on things I have tweeted and have written in the past.
Meanwhile, speaking of racist, bigoted comments, the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, over the weekend suggested that federal relief for those who are suffering from Hurricane Ian would only be dispersed based on racial equity. Now, Florida has huge low-income communities that are largely Caucasian, and they have incredibly affluent neighborhoods which are almost entirely made up of individuals who Ms. Harris and her party would condescendingly refer to as people of color. See, over here we just call them Americans. And if their roof has been blown off, why can't the vice president see them that way too? See, for our part, we'll continue to do whatever we can to assist these communities, all the communities who most need our help. Here at Salem News Channel, our colleague, Mike Gallagher, who lives down in Florida, he's raising money for the families who need it most. Just text Ian to 91999 and people will directly benefit from your generosity. You text Ian to 91999 and whatever you give will go directly to those in need. And we won't prioritize anyone based on their race or religion or anything. Wouldn't it be nice if our federal government treated us with that kind of compassion and dignity and respect? Well, I guess that's just one more thing we can pray for.